Chapter 9, Nationalism and Sectionalism. The War of 1812 showed how far the United States was from being an integrated nation. The Bank of the United States had expired, transportation was poor, and manufacturing had been required to counter the British embargo, even though they wanted the United States to remain Jefferson's agrarian republic. Republicans, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, believed manufacturers needed protection if the United States was to become independent from Britain. In 1815, President James Madison proposed a plan for government-promoted economic development that became known as the American System. This system would rest on a new national bank, a tariff on imports to protect and foster manufacturing, and federal financing of road and canal construction called internal improvements. Although the tariff and national bank became law in 1816, Madison vetoed an internal improvements bill. He was afraid that if the national government were given powers not expressed in the Constitution, it would interfere with individual liberty and slavery in southern states. The Second Bank of the United States, a private profit-making corporation that served as the government's financial agent, soon became resented by many Americans. The Second Bank of the United States was also tasked with regulating the volume of paper money printed by private banks to prevent fluctuations and inflation. Today, only the federal government issues paper money, the total of which is determined by the Federal Reserve Bank rather than the amount of gold held at the repository at Fort Knox. During the 19th century, however, paper money consisted of notes promising to pay the bearer a specified amount on demand, and its value was determined by the issuing institution's reputation for stability. Values often fluctuated wildly as banks printed more currency than they held. Banks relied on public confidence, and the Bank of the United States was supposed to prevent overissuance. Because it held federal funds and large amounts of currency from various banks. The prospect of the government demanding that currency was intended to guard against banks acting improperly. For if a bank could not provide when asked, it would have to suspend operations. And I'll give just a few seconds or so on this slide. I jumped ahead of myself. I spoke on that on slide 2. So let you read through that, get your notes. American law in this period increasingly supported the efforts of entrepreneurs to participate in the market revolution while protecting them from local governments and liability that might interfere with their activities. The corporate form of business organization, in which a corporate firm receives a charter from the government and stockholders are not individually liable for company debts, became central to economic life in this period. Corporations found reinforcement in Supreme Court decisions that validated their legal status. Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1818 defined corporate charters issued by states as contracts, thus preventing future lawmakers from altering or rescinding them. Gibbons versus Ogden, 5 years later, determined that a monopoly granted by the New York legislature for steamboat navigation. Meanwhile, at the local level, courts found businesses blameless for property damage and held that employers had full authority in the workplace, even using old conspiracy laws to convict workers who joined unions or went on strike. Only in 1842 did the Massachusetts State Court render a decision in Commonwealth versus Hunt, stating there was nothing inherently illegal in striking or unionizing. And I do remember back in the 80s, both my mom and dad, they were part of a union. My mom worked at a sewing factory, and my dad at a sawmill, and at different times while they worked there, they were on strike. Rather than regulate the currency and loans issued by local banks, the Bank of the United States contributed to widespread speculation, mostly in land after the War of 1812. When high European demand for American farm goods decreased back to normal levels in 1819, this bubble burst. Falling land prices ruined farmers and businessmen who could no longer pay their loans. Banks failed and unemployment spread in eastern cities. The short-lived panic of 1819 disrupted the political harmony established after the war's end. Some states controversially provided relief to debtors, much to the chagrin of creditors. Most important, the panic reinforced many Americans' long-standing distrust of banks, and it undermined the reputation of the Bank of the United States, which was blamed for the panic. When states retaliated against the banks of the United States by taxing its local branches, the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, ruled in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 that the Bank of the United States was a legitimate exercise of congressional authority under the Constitution. This directly contradicted the strict constructionist view that Congress could use only those powers expressly in the Constitution. With the Missouri controversy, Federalist Party, led by Adams, is badly weakened. Strong in the Northeast. After the War of 1812, there's a feeling of pride and nationalism would sweep the nation. It's called the era of good feeling, no political problems, trade is increasing. In 1819, the Missouri Territory requested admission into Union as a state. With the Missouri controversy, there's a problem. There's 22 states, 11 are free, and 11 are slave states. Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, which would give the South advantage in the Senate. Would give them 12 slave states and the advantage in the Senate. And currently, or at this time, during this time period, there is good balance in the Senate. The North objects. The South just screams that they'll leave the Union if not allowed in as a slave state. Secession threats are heard. Wouldn't be for the first time that they would hear this from South Carolina. They've been threatening to leave since the Revolutionary War. The solution. You bring Missouri in as a slave state. You bring Maine in as a free state to keep the balance. So that way there would be 12 free states, 12 slave states. In this treaty, no more slave states admitted from the area called Louisiana Territory north of a certain line. The North is having a fence put around slave states to prevent slavery from spreading north of the Ohio River. But the South, they do not realize this at the time. It's known as the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. Henry Clay gets the reputation as a great compromiser because he proposed it. And just to map, kind of just see the unorganized territory, our green states here, the free states, pink states, the slave states. The Missouri Compromise temporarily settled the question of expansion of slavery by dividing the Louisiana Purchase into free and slave states. Between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rebelled and established independent nations, including Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. By 1825, Spain's empire in the Western Hemisphere contained only Cuba and Puerto Rico. Americans sympathized with these Republican revolutions, and the United States was the first to recognize these new governments. Important parallels existed between the Spanish-American revolutions and the United States War for Independence, primarily that they were precipitated by imperial attempts to raise more revenue out of colonies. The Spanish government had been trying to strengthen its hold over the empire since the late 18th century. Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, and in 1812, a constitution was adopted that granted more localized control to colonies. When the king was restored in 1814, he revoked the constitution and attempted to reassert imperial control. As in the British colonies, local elites demanded status and equality. Declarations of independence in Spanish colonies resembled the United States Declaration, such as Venezuela's 1811 document that employed language strikingly similar to Jefferson's. Unlike the British colonies, however, the Spanish Empire was too vast and disconnected for common nationhood, and it dissolved into 17 independent countries. While communication and printing in the Spanish territories was scarce, imported literature spread the era's revolutionary ideas. In some ways, the Latin American constitutions that emerged were more democratic than the United States Constitution. Most attempted to create a single national people out of diverse populations, and therefore extended the right to vote to blacks and American Indians, while black soldiers fought on both sides of the revolutionary conflicts, which set the motion to end slavery. The Latin American wars tended to last longer and were often followed by periods of destructive civil war. The result was greater difficulty achieving economic development than in the United States.